The river moves through the land in the same direction it has always moved. Water passes over stones that have been smoothed by countless seasons of flowing. The banks hold mud that dries and cracks under the sun each year. Grasses grow near the water where the soil remains damp enough to sustain them. The same types of plants return to the same types of places season after season. People live along the river in villages built from materials found in the surrounding area. Mud bricks dry in rows under the sun before being stacked into walls. Roofs are made from bundled reeds that have been cut and dried and tied together. Doorways face directions that allow air to move through interior spaces during the warmest hours. Each morning begins when light reaches the eastern edge of the land. Sounds of movement start in different households at approximately the same time each day. Mats are rolled and placed against walls where they will remain until evening. Containers are checked for water that was carried the previous day from the river. The ground outside each home has been swept many times before. Dust settles during the night and is swept again in the morning. Paths between homes follow the same routes they followed the previous day. Feet have pressed the earth into these paths through repeated use over long periods. Animals are kept in areas near the homes where they can be watched. They require water and food that must be provided each day. Their movements are predictable and their sounds are familiar to those who tend them. The same tasks are performed for them each morning in the same order. Fields extend beyond the village in sections that have been worked for many generations. The soil is turned and prepared according to patterns established long before the current season. Seeds are placed into ground that has received seeds of the same type many times. The work follows steps that do not change significantly from one year to the next. Children move through the village along paths they have learned by watching others. They carry smaller versions of the containers adults carry to the river. Their tasks are simpler but follow the same basic patterns of movement and repetition. They learn by doing the same actions many times until the actions become ordinary. The sun crosses the sky at a pace that does not vary. Shadows move across the ground in predictable directions throughout each day. Temperatures rise during certain hours and fall during others according to patterns everyone has observed before. The air smells of earth and water and smoke from cooking fires. This is the setting where days unfold in familiar sequences. Each day resembles the previous day in most of its essential aspects. The river continues to flow. The land continues to receive light and then darkness. People continue to perform tasks that sustain the conditions under which they live. Water must be carried from the river to the village each day. The containers used for this purpose are made from clay that has been shaped and fired. Each container holds approximately the same amount of water as other containers of its type. Handles are formed on opposite sides to allow for balanced carrying across shoulders or on heads. The path to the river descends gradually from the village toward the water's edge. Stones mark certain points along this path where feet have stepped countless times. The ground is harder in some places and softer in others depending on drainage patterns. During certain seasons the path becomes muddy near the bottom where water seeps upward through soil. People walk to the river in the early morning before heat accumulates in the air. They walk with empty containers that make quiet sounds as they knock against legs or hips. The same people tend to walk at approximately the same time each day. They pass each other on the path and exchange brief acknowledgments or walk in silence. At the river's edge the bank slopes down into the water at an angle. Mud covers the stones in this area and must be navigated carefully to avoid slipping. The water appears brown with sediment that the river carries from places upstream. This sediment eventually settles in slower areas or along the banks where plants grow. Containers are filled by holding them just below the surface of the water. Air bubbles rise as water enters the opening and displaces what was inside. When a container is full, it becomes heavy and must be lifted with care. Water spills during the lifting process and runs back into the river or soaks into the mud. The return walk to the village is slower due to the added weight. Arms and shoulders bear the load in positions that have been learned through years of practice. Steps are placed more deliberately on the incline to prevent stumbling. Water sloshes inside the containers with each movement, but most remains inside if the pace is steady. Once back in the village, the water is poured into larger storage vessels kept inside homes. These vessels are made of clay like the carrying containers but are too large to move easily. They sit in corners or against walls where they remain throughout the year. Water from these vessels is used for drinking and cooking and washing throughout the day. The same carrying process happens again in the afternoon when the morning water has been used. Some households require more trips than others depending on the number of people and animals being sustained. Children learn to carry smaller amounts first and gradually take on containers of standard size. Bread is made each day from grain that has been stored in sealed containers. The grain must be ground into flour using stones shaped specifically for this purpose. One stone sits stationary on the ground while another stone is moved back and forth across its surface. Grain is placed between the stones and pressure grinds it into progressively finer particles. The grinding produces a rhythmic sound that can be heard from other parts of the village. The work requires sustained effort and is typically done in the morning hours. Arms move in repetitive motions that become automatic after long practice. The flour collects around the edges of the lower stone and is swept into a container. Water is added to the flour in amounts that create a workable dough. Hands knead the mixture until it reaches a consistency that holds together but remains pliable. The dough is divided into portions that will become individual loaves or flat rounds. Each portion is shaped by hand into forms that have been made the same way many times before. Fires for baking are built in outdoor areas shared by several households. Wood and dried plant materials are arranged and lit using embers from the previous day's fire. The flames grow and then settle into steady heat that radiates from the burning material. Flat stones are placed over the fire or clay ovens are heated to temperatures suitable for baking. Dough is placed onto the hot surfaces where it begins to cook immediately. The smell of baking bread spreads through the village at approximately the same time each day. Loaves are turned when the bottom surface has browned and firmed. The bread is removed when both sides have cooked through and placed on surfaces to cool. Eating happens when the work of preparation has been completed. People sit on mats or on the ground in shaded areas near their homes. Bread is broken into pieces and shared among those present. Vegetables that have been boiled or roasted are eaten with the bread. Water is drunk from shared cups that are refilled as needed. The meal proceeds without conversation or with only brief exchanges about immediate matters. Eating is a task performed regularly and does not require much attention. When the food has been consumed, the mats are shaken and returned to their places. Containers are rinsed with water and set aside to dry in the sun. Animals require feeding after the people have eaten. Grain and plant materials are distributed in areas where the animals are kept. Goats and sheep eat from troughs or directly from the ground where food has been scattered. They make sounds while eating that are familiar to everyone nearby. Water is provided in containers large enough for multiple animals to drink from at once. The animals must be moved to different areas during the day to prevent overgrazing. A person walks with them to fields where plants are growing that the animals can eat. The person remains with the animals to keep them from wandering too far or entering areas where crops are planted. This watching requires many hours and is done while sitting or standing in available shade. Fields that produce crops are checked each day for signs of growth or problems. Soil around young plants is loosened with simple tools to allow water and air to reach roots. Weeds are pulled from between rows and left to dry in the sun. Insects are removed by hand when they are found on leaves or stems that show damage. Irrigation channels carry water from the river to the fields during seasons when rain is insufficient. These channels must be maintained to prevent blockages or collapses of their earthen walls. Mud and plant debris are cleared out using hands or flat tools. The water flows along paths that have been established and re-established many times over generations. The channels are walked each morning to check for problems that may have developed overnight. Small breaches in the walls are repaired with mud pressed firmly into gaps. Sticks and stones are cleared from the water's path to maintain steady flow. The work is done section by section, moving from the river toward the furthest fields. Tools used for field work are kept in specific places when not in use. They are simple implements made from wood and stone and rope. Handles are smooth from repeated gripping over long periods of time. Edges that contact the soil are dulled gradually and must be resharpened on rough stones. The resharpening is done during hours when field work cannot be performed effectively. A person sits in shade and moves a tool's edge against an abrasive surface. The motion is repeated until the edge can cut through plant stems cleanly. Other tools are checked for damage and repaired with available materials when possible. Clothing is washed in the river when it has been worn for several days. Fabric is soaked in the water and rubbed against itself to loosen dirt. The same motions are used each time this task is performed. Water is wrung from the fabric by twisting it between both hands with force. Wet clothing is draped over bushes or ropes to dry in the sun and air. The fabric becomes stiff as it dries and must be shaken to restore some softness. When dry, the clothing is folded and stored until it is needed again. The same pieces are worn repeatedly in rotation with other similar pieces. The sun rises over the eastern horizon at times that shift gradually with the seasons. Light reaches the village before it reaches the fields beyond due to differences in elevation. Shadows cast by structures shorten as the sun climbs higher in the sky. The same progression occurs each day with only minor variations in timing throughout the year. Mornings begin with the same sequence of movements in each household. Sleeping mats are rolled tightly and placed where they will not obstruct daytime activities. The floor is swept with bundled plant stalks that have been dried and tied together. Dust collects near doorways and is swept outside into areas where it disperses into the air. Fires from the previous evening have usually died down to ash and small embers. New fuel is added in small amounts to coax flames back into existence. Dried grass and small twigs catch first and burn quickly with crackling sounds. Larger pieces of wood are placed on top once the smaller materials are burning steadily. Smoke rises from multiple cooking fires throughout the village at approximately the same time. The smoke drifts in whatever direction the wind carries it that particular morning. On days without wind, the smoke rises straight upward and hangs in the air. I sometimes water from smoke that enters homes through doorways and other openings. Grain storage containers are open to access the day's supply for grinding and cooking. The containers are sealed with fitted lids that prevent insects and moisture from entering. Inside the containers, grain sits in layers that have been added over time. Hands scoop out amounts needed for immediate use and the lids are replaced securely. The grinding stones are kept in the same location they occupied the day before. The lower stone has a slight depression in its center from years of use. The upper stone fits comfortably in both hands and has smooth areas where fingers naturally grip. Grain is poured onto the lower stone in quantities that can be processed efficiently. The grinding motion moves the upper stone forward and backward across the grain repeatedly. Pressure is applied downward while moving to crush the grain between the two stone surfaces. The sound produced is steady and rhythmic and becomes part of the morning soundscape. Flour accumulates around the grinding area and is gathered periodically into a bowl. Children watch this process before learning to perform it themselves with smaller practice stones. Their efforts produce coarser flour at first because the necessary pressure and rhythm take time to develop. They practice during hours when the work is not urgently needed for the day's meals. Water and flour are combined in the same bowl used for many previous batches of dough. The proportions are estimated based on experience rather than measured with tools. Fingers mix the ingredients until they begin to bind together into a cohesive mass. More water or flour is added in small amounts if the consistency is not yet correct. Kneading works the dough until it becomes smooth and elastic under the hands. This process takes several minutes of continuous pressing and folding and turning. The dough is shaped into a round form and covered with a cloth while other preparations continue. It sits for a period of time before being divided into smaller portions for baking. Other foods are prepared alongside the bread depending on what is available that day. Vegetables from the previous day's gathering are washed in water from the storage vessels. They are cut into pieces using blades made from sharpened stone or metal when available. The pieces are placed in clay pots that will be positioned over the fire. Onions and garlic are common additions to the pots because they grow reliably in local conditions. Their outer layers are peeled away and discarded onto the ground outside. The inner portions are chopped into small pieces that will soften during cooking. Their smell begins to spread as soon as they are cut and intensifies when heated. Water is added to the pots along with salt that has been obtained through trade. The pots are placed on stones positioned around the fire to hold them steady. Heat from below causes the water to gradually warm and then bubble gently. The contents are stirred occasionally with wooden implements to prevent sticking to the pot's interior surface. Flatbread dough is divided by pulling pieces from the larger mass by hand. Each piece is pressed and stretched into a thin round shape on a clean stone surface. The rounds are roughly the same size because the motion of forming them has been repeated countless times. They are stacked with small amounts of flour between them to prevent sticking together. The baking surface is wiped clean of ash before the first bread is placed on it. Heat rises from below and cooks the bottom surface while the top remains exposed to air. Small bubbles form in the dough as trapped air expands from the heat. The bread is flipped to cook the other side for approximately the same amount of time. Each finished piece is removed and placed on a woven mat to cool slightly. The next piece of dough is immediately placed on the hot surface to maintain continuous cooking. This process continues until all the dough portions have been baked into bread. The smell of baked bread is present in the village throughout the morning hours. Meanwhile, the vegetable mixture in the pots has softened and absorbed the flavors of the other ingredients. The fire is allowed to decrease in intensity as the cooking nears completion. A small amount of oil may be added near the end if it is available. The pots are moved to cooler areas using cloths wrapped around their hot exterior surfaces. The morning meal is eaten when all the food items have finished cooking. People gather in groups determined by household membership and extended family connections. Bread is torn by hand and used to scoop portions of vegetables from shared bowls. Eating is done without utensils beyond the bread itself, which serves multiple purposes. Conversation during meals is minimal and focuses on practical matters related to the day's tasks. Observations about weather conditions or animal behavior may be shared briefly. Silence is common and not considered unusual or uncomfortable among those eating together. The meal concludes when the available food has been consumed or when people are no longer hungry. Cleaning after the meal involves rinsing containers with water carried from the river earlier. The water used for rinsing often contains small amounts of food residue afterward. This water is given to animals or poured onto the ground where plants grow. The containers are turned upside down to drain and dry in the sunlight. Sleeping mats are taken outside and shaken to remove dust and small debris that accumulates. They are beaten with hands or sticks to dislodge particles embedded in the woven fibers. The mats are left in direct sunlight for a period of time before being returned inside. This process is repeated regularly to maintain the mats in usable condition. Floors inside homes are swept again during midday even though they were swept in the morning. Dust enters through doorways and gaps in walls throughout the day as wind blows outside. The sweeping is done quickly and requires little attention or effort. The same paths across the floor are swept most frequently because they receive the most foot traffic. Outdoor work areas are also swept or tidied during breaks between other tasks. Scraps of material from various activities are gathered and sorted into piles. Some scraps can be reused for secondary purposes while others are discarded in designated areas. The sorting is done according to familiar categories that everyone understands without explanation. Animals in their pens create waste that must be removed periodically to prevent accumulation. The waste is collected using flat tools and carried to fields where it will be spread. It dries in the sun and eventually breaks down into the soil over time. This process enriches the soil and improves conditions for growing crops in subsequent seasons. The animals are checked throughout the day to ensure they have adequate water and shade. Their water containers are refilled when the level drops below a certain point. Shade is provided by structures made from poles and woven mats that block direct sunlight. The animals rest during the hottest hours and become more active when temperatures decrease. Young animals stay close to older ones and follow their movements through the penned areas. They learn where water is located and where food is typically distributed by observation. The sounds they make are higher in pitch than those of fully grown animals. Their presence requires additional attention, but the tasks involved remain similar to existing routines. Clothing is made from plant fibers that have been processed through multiple steps. The fibers are separated from the rest of the plant material by soaking and beating. They are dried in the sun until they become lighter in color and texture. The dried fibers are twisted together to form threads that can be woven or sewn. Weaving is done on simple frames constructed from wooden poles lashed together with cordage. Vertical threads are strung across the frame at even intervals determined by the weaver. Horizontal threads are passed over and under the vertical ones in alternating patterns. The process advances slowly as each row is added and pressed against the previous one. The fabric that results from this weaving is coarse but durable enough for regular wear. It is cut into rectangular pieces that will be wrapped or draped around the body. Edges are sometimes folded and stitched to prevent unraveling during use and washing. The stitching is done with bone needles and thread made from the same plant fibers. Simple garments require no complex fitting or tailoring to bodies of different sizes. A length of fabric is wrapped around the waist and secured with a belt or cord. Another piece may be draped over the shoulders and tied or pinned in place. Adjustments are made by changing how the fabric is folded or where it is fastened. The same basic garment styles are worn by most people in the village. Differences appear mainly in the condition of the fabric or small variations in wrapping methods. Older garments show signs of wear along edges and in areas subject to friction. They are patched when holes develop or cut down into smaller pieces for other uses. Footwear is made from woven plant materials or animal hides when those materials are available. Sandals consist of flat soles with straps that pass between the toes and around the ankles. The soles wear thin over time from contact with the ground and must be replaced. The straps break occasionally and are retied or replaced with new cordage. Most work is done while barefoot because footwear wears out quickly under constant use. Feet become hardened from regular contact with dirt and stone surfaces throughout the village. Thorns and sharp objects are avoided when noticed, but minor cuts and scratches occur regularly. These heal without treatment in most cases unless they become infected from dirt entering the wound. Hair is kept tied back or cut short to prevent interference with daily tasks. Longer hair collects dust and tangles easily in windy conditions or during physical work. It is washed in the river using the same water that serves other cleaning purposes. Fingers work through the hair to remove debris and loosen dirt accumulated since the last washing. Some people trim hair using sharpened blades or allow it to break naturally at certain lengths. Children often have their hair cut by older family members who perform the task quickly. The cut hair falls to the ground and is swept away with other debris. No particular style is followed beyond keeping hair at a manageable length. The river provides water for washing bodies as well as clothes and hair during warmer seasons. People wade into shallow areas where the current is gentle and the bottom is not too muddy. They splash water over themselves and rub skin to remove accumulated dirt and sweat. The water carries away what has been loosened and flows downstream toward other locations. During colder seasons, washing happens less frequently or is done quickly to minimize discomfort. Water can be heated over fires and used for partial washing inside homes when needed. A small amount of warm water is poured from a container while hands scrub the skin. The used water drips onto the floor and is swept outside afterward. Soap is made occasionally by combining ashes from fires with animal fats in specific proportions. The mixture is stirred and heated until it thickens into a substance that helps remove oils. This soap is harsh and dries the skin but serves its purpose for periodic deep cleaning. Most regular washing is done with water alone since soap production requires time and materials. Teeth are cleaned by chewing the ends of certain plant stems until they fray into brushes. The frayed ends are rubbed against teeth to remove food particles and film that builds up. Some people use their fingers to rub ashes or salt against their teeth for additional cleaning. These methods are employed irregularly rather than at set times each day. Nails on fingers and toes grow continuously and are trimmed when they become long enough to break. They are cut or filed using rough stones or broken pieces of harder materials. The trimmed pieces fall to the ground and are lost among the dirt and dust. Hangnails are pulled or bitten off when they catch on fabric or cause discomfort. Skin becomes dry and cracked in certain weather conditions or from repeated exposure to water and sun. Small amounts of oil or fat are rubbed into the skin to provide some relief. These substances are the same ones used for cooking or lamp fuel depending on availability. The application is done without regularity and only when dryness becomes bothersome. Minor injuries from daily work are common and generally ignored unless they impede function. Cuts and scrapes are rinsed with water if they are noticed soon after occurring. Bruises develop from bumps and falls and fade over time without intervention. Blisters form on hands and feet from repetitive friction and eventually toughen into calluses. Splinters from wood or thorns from plants are removed by squeezing the surrounding skin or using a sharp point. The area may bleed slightly when the foreign object is extracted, but this stops quickly. Infection sometimes develops if dirt enters a wound and remains there for extended periods. Infected areas become swollen and painful and may require draining or prolonged cleaning. Illness occurs periodically and is addressed with rest and reduced food intake until symptoms pass. A person who feels unwell lies on their mat and drinks water when thirsty. Others continue with daily tasks and check occasionally to see if the ill person needs anything. Most illnesses resolve within several days without specific treatment beyond rest and hydration. Certain plants are known to help with particular ailments based on long-standing observations and repeated use. Leaves or roots are boiled in water to extract their beneficial properties into a tea. The tea is consumed in small amounts throughout the day until the condition improves. The same plants are used generation after generation for the same types of problems. Headaches are treated by resting in dark, quiet spaces away from bright sunlight and noise. A cloth soaked in cool water may be placed on the forehead while lying down. The headache usually diminishes after a period of rest, though it may return later. No other treatment is generally attempted beyond waiting for the pain to subside naturally. Stomach discomfort from eating spoiled food or drinking contaminated water leads to vomiting or diarrhea. The body expels what is causing the problem and the person becomes weakened temporarily. Extra water is consumed to replace what has been lost through these processes. Plain bread or grain porridge is eaten in small amounts once the acute symptoms have passed. Coughs and congestion occur more frequently during certain seasons when the air is damp or dusty. Steam from heated water is breathed in to loosen congestion in the nose and chest. Honey mixed with water soothes throats that are raw from coughing repeatedly. The symptoms persist for varying lengths of time before gradually diminishing on their own. Fevers cause the body to become hot and the person to sweat more than usual. Cool water is dabbed on the forehead and wrists to provide some comfort during the fever. The person rests under lighter coverings to avoid becoming too warm while still maintaining some covering. Food is usually not desired during a fever and is not forced upon the ill person. Children recover from most ailments more quickly than adults in general observation. They resume normal activity soon after symptoms fade and appear not to remember the discomfort. Adults take longer to regain full strength after being ill for several days. Work resumes gradually rather than returning immediately to the previous level of activity and duration. Older people in the village experience illness more frequently and recover more slowly than younger ones. They rest for longer periods and require more assistance with basic tasks during recovery. Others bring them water and food and check on them throughout each day. The recovery process can extend across many days before normal function returns completely. Some illnesses do not resolve and persist across weeks or longer stretches of time. The person adapts to living with ongoing symptoms and continues working when able to do so. Tasks are modified to accommodate reduced capacity or strength that does not return to previous levels. Others in the household compensate by taking on additional portions of the shared work. Fields are prepared for planting during specific times determined by seasonal patterns observed over many years. The soil must be turned to break up compacted layers and expose fresh earth to air. This turning is done with wooden implements that have been shaped to penetrate the ground efficiently. The work requires repeated motions of lifting and pressing the tool into the soil. Each section of a field is worked systematically until the entire area has been turned. The person performing this task moves backward across the field in rows that run parallel to each other. Soil that has been turned appears darker and has a different texture than untouched ground. Clumps of earth are broken apart by striking them with the flat side of the tool. Stones that are uncovered during the turning process are removed and placed at the field's edge. These stones accumulate over time into piles that mark boundaries between different planted areas. Smaller stones remain in the soil because removing every one would require more time than is practical. They cause the tool to strike hard surfaces occasionally and produce jarring impacts. After the soil has been turned, it is left to rest for a period of days. Rain may fall during this time and soften the earth further by soaking into the loosened layers. If rain does not come, then water from the irrigation channels is directed across the field. The water flows over the surface and seeps downward into the spaces between particles of soil. Seeds are distributed across the prepared field by hand in amounts estimated through experience. They are scattered in sweeping motions that spread them relatively evenly over the designated area. Some seeds land close together while others fall in more isolated positions depending on the randomness of distribution. Additional seeds are scattered in areas that appear to have received too few in the initial pass. A lighter tool is dragged across the seeded field to cover the seeds with a thin layer of soil. This covering protects them from birds and helps maintain moisture around them as they begin to germinate. The dragging motion creates shallow furrows across the surface that will fill in gradually as rain and irrigation smooth them. Birds arrive in the fields soon after planting and search for exposed seeds to eat. People walk through the fields making noise or throwing small stones to discourage the birds from landing. The birds fly to nearby trees and wait before returning when the people move away. This cycle repeats throughout the day until enough seeds have sprouted to be less vulnerable. Germination begins when conditions of moisture and temperature allow the seeds to swell and crack open. Small shoots emerge from the seeds and push upward through the soil toward the light. These first shoots are pale and fragile and can be damaged easily by disturbance. They gradually develop green color as they reach the surface and begin producing their own sustenance. The young plants are monitored each day for signs of healthy growth or problems requiring attention. Weeds begin growing among the planted crops and must be removed before they compete too aggressively. Pulling weeds is done carefully to avoid disturbing the roots of the desired plants nearby. The pulled weeds are left on the ground to dry and decompose or are fed to animals. Insects appear on the plants and consume portions of leaves or stems if not controlled. Some insects are picked off by hand and crushed or thrown to the ground. Others are too numerous to remove individually and are accepted as an inevitable loss. Birds that eat insects are tolerated in the fields despite also eating some seeds and grain. Water is applied to the growing plants according to the moisture level observed in the soil. During dry periods, the irrigation channels are open to allow water to flow into the fields. The water spreads across the surface and soaks into the ground around the plant roots. Channels are closed again when adequate moisture has been delivered to avoid oversaturation. Plants grow taller and develop more leaves as days pass and conditions remain favorable. The rate of growth varies between individual plants even within the same field under similar conditions. Some plants are naturally more vigorous while others struggle and remain smaller throughout their development. The weaker plants still produce some yield and are not removed from the field. Flowering occurs when the plants reach a certain stage of maturity determined by their internal processes. The flowers are small and not particularly noticeable among the green foliage surrounding them. Pollination happens through wind or insects moving between plants and transferring pollen from one flower to another. This process is not controlled or managed but occurs naturally without intervention. After pollination, the flowers begin forming seed heads or fruit depending on the type of plant. These developing structures gradually swell and ripen over a period of weeks under the sun. The plants direct their energy toward producing seeds rather than additional green growth at this stage. Lower leaves may yellow and dry as resources are reallocated to the reproductive structures. Harvest time is determined by observing the color and texture of the ripening crops in the fields. Grain heads turn from green to golden and the individual kernels harden and become dry. Pressing a kernel between the teeth produces a crunching sound when it is ready for harvest. Testing is done in different areas of the field because ripening may not occur uniformly. Cutting the mature plants is done with curved blades designed to sever multiple stems in a single motion. The person performing this work moves through the field in the same systematic manner used during planting. Cut plants are gathered into bundles and tied with pieces of the plant stems twisted together. These bundles are stood upright in the field to continue drying in the sun and air. After sufficient drying, the bundles are transported from the field to a threshing area near the village. The grain heads are separated from the stalks by beating them against hard surfaces or trampling them underfoot. Animals may be driven across piles of harvested plants to help break the grain free from its casings. The loosened grain falls to the ground and is gathered while the stalks are collected separately. Winnowing separates the grain kernels from the lighter chaff and debris mixed with them after threshing. The mixture is tossed into the air using flat baskets or scoops on breezy days. The wind carries away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain falls back into the basket. This process is repeated multiple times until the grain is relatively clean and free of debris. The cleaned grain is stored in sealed containers that protect it from moisture and pests until needed. Storage areas are kept as dry as possible to prevent the grain from molding or rotting. Containers are checked periodically for signs of insect infestation or other problems that could spoil the contents. Grain that shows signs of spoilage is removed and the container is cleaned before being refilled. Some portion of the harvested grain is set aside to serve as seed for the next planting season. This seed grain is selected from the healthiest plants and stored separately from grain intended for consumption. The amount saved is based on the area expected to be planted and the typical seeding rate. Additional seed is saved as a reserve in case germination rates are lower than expected. Stalks that remain after the grain has been removed are bundled and stored for other purposes. They are used as fuel for fires when dried thoroughly or as bedding material for animals. Some stalks are woven into mats or incorporated into roof repairs when their structure is still intact. The material breaks down over time and eventually returns to the soil when scattered across fields. Empty fields after harvest are left fallow or planted with different crops that grow during other seasons. The fallow period allows the soil to recover nutrients that were depleted by the previous planting. Animals may graze on whatever vegetation grows naturally in the resting fields during this time. Their manure adds fertility back into the soil while they consume the volunteer plants. The cycle of field preparation and planting begins again when the appropriate season returns once more. The same fields are worked in the same manner they were worked in previous years. Tools are maintained and repaired between cycles to ensure they remain functional for the next use. Knowledge of these processes is passed from older workers to younger ones through observation and practice. Structures that provide shelter require ongoing maintenance to remain functional throughout the changing seasons. Walls made from mud bricks develop cracks as the material dries and contracts over time. These cracks are filled with fresh mud pressed into the gaps using hands or flat tools. The repair mud dries and hardens to match the surrounding wall surface within several days. Roofs constructed from bundled reeds and plant materials deteriorate from exposure to sun and occasional rain. Individual bundles that show excessive wear are removed and replaced with newly prepared materials. The replacement process involves untying the damaged bundle and securing a fresh one in the same position. Cordage used to hold the bundles in place is checked and replaced when it shows signs of fraying. Water that enters through roof gaps during rainstorms creates damp spots on interior floors and walls. These areas are dried by increasing air circulation through open doorways or by building small fires inside. The source of the leak is identified by observing where water drips or runs during the next rainfall. Additional layers of material are added to the exterior roof surface above the problem area. Doorways have no fitted doors in most structures but may have woven mats that can be hung. These mats provide some privacy and reduce the amount of dust that blows inside during windy periods. The mats are tied at the top to a horizontal pole and can be pushed aside easily. They wear out from repeated handling and exposure and are replaced when they become too damaged. Floors inside homes are packed earth that becomes smooth and hard from continuous foot traffic. Loose dirt accumulates on the surface daily and is swept out through the doorway each morning. In some structures the floor is treated with water mixed with clay to create a harder surface. This treatment is reapplied periodically when the floor begins to show excessive wear or dust generation. Storage areas within homes consist of corners or alcoves where containers and materials are kept. Clay vessels holding grain or water sit directly on the floor in these designated spaces. Smaller items are placed on simple shelves made from flat stone supported by mud brick columns. The arrangement is practical rather than decorative and focused on accessibility for daily use. Sleeping areas are defined by the space where mats are unrolled each evening rather than by permanent furnishings. The same area is used night after night by the same individuals within each household. Personal items are few and are kept near the sleeping area in small baskets or cloth bundles. These items include extra clothing or small tools specific to individual tasks and responsibilities. Cooking areas are located outside the main sleeping structure in most cases to reduce smoke accumulation inside. A fire pit is established in a cleared space with stones arranged to support cooking vessels. The pit is cleaned of ash periodically when the accumulation interferes with fire building or vessel placement. Ash is scattered in the fields or used in soap making depending on current needs. Wood for fuel is gathered from areas where dead branches and fallen trees are available. Living trees are not cut unless absolutely necessary because they provide shade and other benefits. The gathered wood is broken or cut into lengths that fit easily into the fire pit. It is stacked near the cooking area in amounts sufficient for several days of use. Kindling materials such as dry grass and small twigs are collected and kept in a dry location. These materials ignite easily and are used to start fires each morning from preserved embers. If embers have died completely, then fire must be generated through friction methods using prepared wooden tools. This process takes longer and requires focused effort until smoke and then flame appear. Clay pots used for cooking develop cracks or chips from thermal stress and handling over extended periods. Small cracks may be tolerated if they do not allow contents to leak out during use. Larger damage renders a pot unusable and it is broken apart for disposal or repurposing. The clay fragments are sometimes ground and mixed into new clay for making replacement vessels. New pots are formed by hand from clay dug from specific locations known to provide suitable material. The clay is needed to remove air pockets and achieve uniform consistency throughout the mass. Pots are shaped by gradually building up walls from a flat base using coils of clay. Each coil is pressed and smoothed into the previous one to create continuous joined surfaces. The shaped pots are left to dry slowly in shaded areas to prevent cracking from rapid moisture loss. Drying takes many days depending on the size of the vessel and ambient humidity levels. When completely dry, the pots are fired in specially prepared pits with sustained high heat. The firing hardens the clay permanently and makes the vessels suitable for holding liquids and withstanding cooking temperatures. Baskets are woven from flexible plant materials that have been soaked to increase their pliability during construction. The weaving begins at the center of what will be the basket bottom and spirals outward. New strands are added as needed by tucking their ends into the existing weave structure. The sides are built up by continuing to weave in an upward direction from the completed base. Different weave patterns create baskets with varying degrees of tightness in their construction and different structural characteristics. Tightly woven baskets can hold small seeds or grain without excessive loss through gaps. Loosely woven baskets allow air circulation and are used for transporting items that do not require containment. Each basket type serves specific purposes based on its construction method and resulting properties. Cordage for tying and securing objects is made by twisting plant fibers together into continuous strands. The fibers are rolled against the thigh using the palm of the hand in a motion that imparts twist. Two twisted strands are then twisted together in the opposite direction to create stronger cordage. The thickness and strength are controlled by the number of fibers used in the initial strands. Longer lengths of cordage are produced by splicing new fibers into the strand before the previous fibers run out. The splice point is twisted together with extra care to maintain strength throughout the length of the finished cordage. Very long pieces are wound into coils for storage and to prevent tangling during handling. Stored cordage is kept dry to prevent rotting of the plant fibers before use. Repairs to tools and implements are performed as damage occurs or when reduced function is noticed. Wooden handles that crack are wrapped with wet cordage that shrinks as it dries and holds the crack closed. Broken tool heads are replaced if spare parts are available or the tool is retired from service. Sharp edges are maintained through regular contact with abrasive stones during routine sharpening sessions. Stone tools that chip or break cannot be repaired but may be reshaped for different purposes if enough material remains. A large blade that breaks may become a smaller scraper or cutting edge after additional shaping work. Unusable stone pieces are discarded in areas where they will not create hazards during other activities. New tools are made to replace those that can no longer perform their intended functions adequately. Knowledge of making and repairing various items is learned through observation and practice over many years. Children watch adults perform these tasks and begin attempting simpler versions with guidance and correction. Skills improve gradually through repetition and accumulated experience with different materials and situations. The same methods are taught to each new generation with only minor variations in technique. Materials for construction and repair are gathered from the surrounding environment as they are needed. Plant stems are cut during seasons when they are most flexible and easiest to work with. Clay is dug when weather conditions make it neither too wet nor too dry for effective processing. Timing of gathering activities follows patterns established through generations of experience with local conditions. Stored materials are inspected periodically to ensure they remain in usable condition during the storage period. Plant materials can become brittle or moldy if stored in conditions that are too dry or too damp. They are moved to different locations or used sooner than planned if deterioration is noticed. Replacement gathering trips are made when stored supplies prove inadequate for upcoming needs and tasks. The amount of material gathered at one time is balanced against storage space and anticipated rate of use. Gathering too much creates storage problems and potential waste from deterioration before use occurs. Gathering too little requires additional trips that consume time that could be used for other necessary activities. Experience guides these decisions, though occasional miscalculations occur and are adjusted for in subsequent cycles. Days are divided into periods based on the position of the sun and the tasks typically performed. Morning begins when light first appears and continues until the sun is high overhead. This period is used for activities that benefit from cooler temperatures and fresh energy after sleep. Water is carried and cooking is done, and animals are tended during these morning hours. Midday is marked by the sun reaching its highest point and heat becoming most intense. Work that requires significant physical exertion is often paused during this time to avoid exhaustion. People rest in shaded areas or inside structures where the air is slightly cooler than outside. Animals also seek shade and become less active until temperatures begin to decrease again. Afternoon extends from midday until the sun approaches the horizon in the west and light begins to fade. Work resumes with tasks that were interrupted earlier or with new activities scheduled for this part of the day. The slightly lower temperatures make physical labor more tolerable than it was during the peak heat. Progress continues on whatever work remains unfinished from the morning period or from previous days. Evening arrives as the sun sets and darkness gradually replaces the remaining light in the sky. Final tasks for the day are completed before it becomes too dark to see clearly. Cooking fires are built up for the evening meal and people gather near their homes. The temperature drops noticeably as the heat accumulated during the day begins to dissipate into the night air. Night is the time for eating the evening meal and for rest after the day's activities. Fires provide light as well as warmth during cooler seasons when temperatures fall significantly after sunset. Conversations happen around the fires, though they tend to be brief and focused on immediate practical matters. Sleep comes when the meal has been consumed and the fire has been allowed to die down. The rhythm of these daily periods repeats with only minor variations throughout the year except during unusual weather. The timing shifts gradually with the changing seasons as days become longer or shorter in duration. Tasks are adjusted to fit within the available daylight hours, but the general sequence remains consistent. People wake and sleep according to natural light cycles rather than any measured or marked time. Seasonal changes bring different conditions that affect both the environment and the work performed within it. A wet season brings more frequent rain that fills the river and saturates the fields with water. The increased moisture supports plant growth but also creates muddy conditions that make some tasks more difficult. Certain crops are planted to take advantage of the abundant water available during this period. A dry season follows when rain becomes infrequent or stops entirely for an extended period. The river level drops and irrigation becomes essential for maintaining crops in the fields without rainfall. Dust becomes more prevalent in the air and on all surfaces as the ground dries out. The vegetation that depends on regular moisture withers unless it receives water from the irrigation system. Temperature variations between seasons are less extreme than the changes in moisture and rainfall patterns. Cooler periods bring relief from the most intense heat but rarely produce conditions cold enough to damage plants. Warmer periods extend the growing season for certain crops and allow for continuous planting throughout most of the year. Clothing adjustments are minimal because the temperature range remains relatively moderate throughout all seasons. Wind patterns shift with the seasons and affect how dust and smoke move through the village. Strong winds during certain times of year require extra effort to keep living areas clean of blown sand. Structures must be checked more frequently for damage when wind loosens roofing materials or widens existing cracks. Fires must be tended more carefully to prevent embers from being carried to unintended locations by gusts. The river's behavior changes with seasonal rainfall patterns even though its basic flow continues year-round. During heavy rain periods, the water becomes more turbulent and carries increased amounts of sediment from upstream areas. The banks may overflow in extreme cases and flood the lowest fields near the water's edge. This flooding deposits fresh soil but can also damage young plants if it occurs at the wrong time. During dry periods, the river shrinks to a smaller channel and the water flows more slowly and gently. The reduced volume makes it easier to access the water but also means it must be carried from farther away. Sediment settles more readily in the slower current and builds up along the banks and bottom. The water may become clearer during these times because less material is being actively transported downstream. Fish are present in the river throughout the year, but their numbers and locations vary with the water conditions. They are caught using woven traps placed in the water where fish are likely to swim while seeking food. The traps are checked daily and any captured fish are removed and brought to the village. Small fish are eaten immediately while larger ones may be dried for consumption over several days. Nets woven from plant fiber cordage are also used to catch fish in shallow areas of the river. The nets are held by two people who walk through the water driving fish toward the stretched material. Fish that encounter the net become tangled in the mesh and are pulled from the water. The net is checked for damage after each use and repaired before the next fishing session. Dried fish are prepared by cleaning them and removing internal organs before hanging them in the sun. Salt is rubbed onto the flesh if it is available to speed the drying process and improve preservation. The fish hang from cordage strung between poles or trees in areas with good air circulation. They become stiff and hard as moisture evaporates and are stored in baskets until ready to be eaten. Birds can be caught using various methods including traps and nets placed in areas they frequent. Small birds are sometimes eaten while larger ones may be kept for their eggs if they can be housed. The eggs provide additional food and are collected regularly once the birds begin laying them consistently. Birds that stop laying or become difficult to maintain are eventually consumed rather than kept indefinitely. Eggs are eaten fresh or can be preserved for short periods by coating them with fat or oil. The coating seals the porous shell and prevents air from entering and spoiling the contents inside. Preserved eggs are stored in cool locations away from direct sunlight to extend their usable life. They are checked before use by placing them in water to see if they float or sink. Wild plants growing near the village or along the river provide supplemental food gathered when they are in season. Leaves from certain plants are picked and eaten raw or cooked along with cultivated vegetables. Seeds and nuts are collected when they ripen and are stored for consumption throughout the year. Roots of some plants are dug up and cooked until they become soft enough to eat. Knowledge of which wild plants are safe to eat is passed down through generations by direct teaching. Children are shown which plants to gather and which to avoid because they are toxic or unpalatable. Mistakes can cause illness or worse, so learning is careful and supervised until the young person demonstrates reliable identification. The same species are gathered in the same locations year after year as they grow back after being harvested. Honey is collected from wild bee colonies found in hollow trees or rock crevices when they are discovered. The collection requires approaching the colony carefully and using smoke to calm the bees before removing honeycomb sections. Stings occur during this process, but the honey obtained is valued enough to justify the discomfort. The honey is stored in sealed containers and used sparingly as a sweetener or medicine. Beeswax from the collected honeycomb is separated from the honey by heating and straining the mixture. The wax floats to the surface as it melts and can be skimmed off and collected. It hardens again as it cools and forms blocks that can be stored indefinitely. The wax is used to seal containers or to make simple candles by dipping cordage repeatedly into melted wax. Gathering activities follow the availability of different food sources throughout the seasonal cycles of the year. Certain fruits ripen during specific months and are collected in quantity when they appear on plants. Nuts fall from trees during their maturation period and are picked from the ground before animals consume them. Timing of gathering trips is based on observation of plant development stages from previous years. Preservation of gathered foods extends their availability beyond the brief period when they are fresh and abundant. Drying in the sun removes moisture that would otherwise allow decay to occur relatively quickly in the warm climate. Dried foods become lighter and more compact and can be stored in less space than fresh equivalents. They are reconstituted by soaking in water before cooking or are eaten in their dried state. Animal pens are constructed from wooden posts driven into the ground at regular intervals around a designated area. Horizontal poles are lashed to the vertical posts with cordage to create barriers that contain the animals inside. The height and spacing of these barriers depend on the size and behavior of the animals being penned. Gaps between poles are kept small enough to prevent the animals from squeezing through or getting stuck. Gates in the pen walls are made from similar materials but are designed to swing open on one side. A gate consists of a frame with crosspieces that is attached to one post with cordage loops that act as hinges. The opposite side of the gate is secured with a removable pole or rope that can be unfastened when access is needed. The gate is open to move animals in or out and to allow cleaning of the interior space. The ground inside the pens becomes compacted from the constant movement and weight of the animals kept there. Manure and urine accumulate on this surface and must be removed periodically to maintain sanitary conditions. The removal is done with flat tools that scrape the material into piles for transport to the fields. Fresh earth or sand may be spread on the pen floor after cleaning to absorb moisture and odors. Water containers inside the pens are large enough to serve multiple animals without requiring constant refilling throughout the day. They are positioned where animals can access them easily but where they are less likely to be knocked over. The containers are checked multiple times daily and refilled when the water level drops below a useful amount. Water that becomes fouled with debris or manure is dumped out and the container is rinsed before being refilled. Feed is distributed in the pens at regular times each day to maintain the animals' health and productivity. Grain is scattered on the ground or placed in troughs depending on the type and number of animals. Plant materials such as cut grasses are brought from fields and placed where the animals can reach them. The amount provided is based on observation of how much is consumed before the next feeding time. Young animals are kept with their mothers in the pens until they are old enough to be weaned. The mothers provide milk and protection while the young learn to eat solid food gradually. Separation occurs when the young animals are feeding independently and no longer require milk for nutrition. The weaned animals may be moved to different pens or integrated with others of similar age and size. Milk is collected from certain animals that produce more than their young require for growth and survival. The collection is done by hand in a rhythmic squeezing motion that draws milk from the udder. A container is positioned below to catch the milk as it is expelled in streams. The process continues until the udder is empty or until the animal becomes restless and uncooperative. Fresh milk is consumed shortly after collection or is processed into other forms for longer storage. Allowing milk to sit and sour produces a thickened substance that can be eaten or used in cooking. Further processing separates fats from the liquid portion to create products with different properties and uses. These transformations require specific conditions of temperature and time that are controlled through experience and observation. Butter is made by agitating milk or cream in a container until the fat particles clump together. The container is shaken or stirred repeatedly for an extended period until the transformation is complete. The butter is removed and the remaining liquid is drained away or saved for other purposes. Butter can be stored for moderate periods if kept cool and protected from contamination by dirt or insects. Cheese is produced by adding substances to milk that cause it to separate into solid curds and liquid whey. The curds are collected and pressed to remove excess moisture and form them into blocks or rounds. Salt is often added during this process to enhance flavor and improve preservation of the finished product. The cheese hardens as it ages and develops stronger flavors over time compared to fresh cheese. Animal hides are removed from butchered animals and processed to prevent decay and make them suitable for use. The hides are scraped clean of remaining flesh and fat using sharp-edged tools held at specific angles. Salt or other preserving substances may be rubbed into the hide to draw out moisture and inhibit bacterial growth. The prepared hides are stretched and dried or treated further depending on their intended final use. Tanning transforms raw hides into leather through prolonged contact with certain plant materials or other tanning agents. The process requires soaking the hides in solutions prepared from tree bark or other sources of tannins. Multiple soakings and dryings occur over an extended period until the hide becomes supple and resistant to decay. The finished leather can be cut and shaped for making various items that require flexible, durable material. Leather pieces are joined together by punching holes along edges and sewing them with cordage or thin leather strips. The holes are made using pointed tools that pierce through the material without tearing it excessively. Stitching follows the line of holes and pulls the edges together into permanent joints when tightened. These joints hold well under normal use but can be cut apart if the item needs to be disassembled. Containers made from leather hold liquids or dry goods and can be sealed by tying the opening closed. The leather must be treated to make it relatively waterproof for liquid storage applications requiring extended contact. Natural oils or waxes are worked into the material to fill pores and create a barrier to water passage. These treatments wear away over time and must be reapplied periodically to maintain the waterproof properties. Bones from butchered animals are saved and used for making tools and small implements that benefit from hardness. The bones are cleaned of all flesh and dried thoroughly before being worked into desired shapes. Cutting and shaping is done by scraping with harder materials or by repeated scoring and breaking along intended lines. Sharp points and edges can be created through careful grinding against rough stone surfaces until the proper form emerges. Bone needles are made from long thin bones or from sections split from larger bones and shaped down. One end is sharpened to a point while the other end has a hole created for threading cordage through. The hole is made by repeatedly scraping or drilling with a harder pointed object until it penetrates through the bone. These needles are used for sewing leather and heavy fabric that would break needles made from softer materials. Antlers and horns are also worked into useful items when they become available from hunted animals or natural shedding. They are harder than regular bone and hold an edge better for certain cutting or scraping applications. The hollow interior of horns can be utilized as small containers after the bone core is removed. The exterior surface can be carved or decorated, though most items are left plain and purely functional. Fat rendered from butchered animals is melted down and strained to remove solid particles and impurities from it. The clarified fat is stored in sealed containers where it solidifies as it cools to room temperature. This fat is used in cooking to add richness to foods or to prevent sticking during preparation. It also serves as a fuel for simple lamps when absorbed into wicks and ignited to produce light. Lamps consist of small clay or stone vessels with a spout or channel for holding a wick in position. The vessel is filled with liquid fat or oil and the wick is positioned so one end sits in the fuel. The exposed end of the wick is lit and burned slowly, drawing fuel upward through capillary action. The flame produced is small but provides enough light for basic tasks during evening and nighttime hours. Wicks for lamps are made from twisted plant fibers or strips of fabric that have been braided together. The material must be absorbent enough to draw oil upward but dense enough to burn slowly and steadily. New wicks are inserted when old ones burn down too far to remain functional in the lamp. The charred ends of used wicks are trimmed away before relighting to ensure a cleaner flame. Smoke from burning lamps accumulates on ceilings and walls as dark residue that builds up over time. This residue is not usually cleaned away unless it becomes thick enough to flake off and fall. The smoke carries a distinctive odor that becomes associated with evening activities and nighttime hours inside structures. Ventilation through doorways and gaps helps reduce the concentration of smoke in occupied spaces during lamp use. Light from lamps is sufficient for conversations and simple tasks but not adequate for detailed work requiring precision. Most activities that need good visibility are scheduled for daylight hours when natural light is abundant and free. Lamps are used primarily for extending useful time slightly beyond sunset rather than for working throughout the night. Sleep remains the primary activity during dark hours when visibility is naturally limited regardless of lamp availability. Mornings follow the same basic pattern regardless of which particular day is occurring within the larger cycle. Eyes open when light penetrates through doorways or gaps in the walls of sleeping structures. The transition from sleep to wakefulness happens gradually without any sudden need to rise immediately. Other people in the same space begin moving at approximately the same time as light reaches them. Mats are rolled up and moved to their storage positions against walls or in corners of the room. The rolling motion is performed the same way each morning and requires no conscious thought about the process. Hands know where to grasp and how to fold the material from countless previous repetitions. The stored mats rest in the same spots they occupied after the previous morning's rolling and every morning before. Sweeping begins once the mats have been cleared from the floor area that will be traversed during the day. The broom moves in the same arcing pattern it traced yesterday and the day before and all previous days. Dust and small debris are pushed toward the doorway where they will be swept outside into the open air. The same corners are swept and the same areas near the walls receive the same attention they always receive. Walking to the river happens along the path that has been walked so many times the feet follow it automatically. Containers are carried in the same manner they were carried yesterday and will be carried again tomorrow. The weight feels familiar and the balance point is known without needing to adjust or think about positioning. Other people on the path move in their accustomed patterns at their expected times, appearing where they usually appear. Water enters the containers with the same sound it made during the previous filling and during all fillings before. The river flows past the same rocks and around the same bend it has always flowed past and around. Mud on the bank has the same texture underfoot that it had yesterday and maintains the same degree of slipperiness. The return walk uphill proceeds at the same pace it always proceeds when containers are full of water. Grain is ground using motions that have been performed thousands of times without variation in their essential character. The upper stone moves forward and back across the lower stone in the same arc and rhythm. Flour accumulates in the same pattern around the grinding area and is swept into containers in the same manner. The sound of grinding blends with other morning sounds that are equally familiar and equally repetitive in their occurrence. Dough is mixed in bowls that have held dough on innumerable previous occasions for the same purpose. Hands knead with pressure and timing learned through years of daily repetition rather than conscious instruction or measurement. The dough reaches the proper consistency when it feels the way it has felt when properly prepared on all other occasions. This recognition comes from tactile memory rather than from any external standard or comparison. Fires are built using the same types of fuel arranged in the same configuration that has proven effective repeatedly. The flames grow in predictable ways and settle into patterns of heat distribution that are thoroughly familiar from daily observation. Smoke rises and disperses according to wind conditions that vary but within a range that has been experienced many times. The fire requires the same periodic additions of fuel to maintain cooking temperature throughout the preparation period. Baking proceeds through the same sequence of placing dough on hot surfaces and waiting for the proper degree of browning. Each piece is turned at the point when experience indicates turning should occur based on color and texture. The finished bread is removed and placed in the same type of location to cool that has been used for cooling bread always. The smell of baking is identical to the smell that has marked this time of morning for as long as anyone can remember. Eating follows preparation without any significant gap or ceremony to mark the transition between activities. Bread is torn and vegetables are scooped and water is drunk in motions that require no planning or consideration. The same sitting positions are adopted on the same mats or ground areas used during previous meals. Chewing and swallowing happen automatically as they must happen whenever food is consumed by any person anywhere. Cleaning after meals involves rinsing containers in water that is poured from storage vessels for exactly this purpose. The rinsing water flows over surfaces and carries away residue that has adhered during cooking and eating processes. Containers are turned upside down in the same spots where they were inverted yesterday to drain and dry. The routine proceeds without interruption or deviation from its established form and sequence of component actions. Animals make the same sounds in the morning that they made the previous morning and every morning before. They move within their pens in patterns determined by the location of water and food and shade within those enclosures. Feeding them requires carrying containers of grain and plant material to the pens and distributing the contents as has been done daily. The animals approach the food in the same manner and begin eating with the same apparent level of interest or indifference. Checking the irrigation channels follows routes that have been walked for the purpose of checking channels on countless prior occasions. The channels carry water or do not carry water depending on whether they have been opened or remain closed from previous settings. Debris that has accumulated since the last check is removed using the same scooping and scraping motions employed during all previous removals. The cleared material is tossed to the side of the channel where it will dry and eventually break down. Fields are visited and plants are observed in the same systematic way that fields are always visited and plants always observed. Changes in the plants are noted as growth or wilting or flowering or ripening according to categories long established through accumulated experience. Weeds are pulled when they appear among the desired plants using grip and pulling motions that have been repeated innumerable times. The pulled weeds are dropped on the ground where they will dry out and stop growing in that location. Tasks in the fields continue until the heat becomes too intense to work comfortably at that level of exertion. The transition to rest happens without any formal signal but simply when the discomfort reaches the point where continuing seems unpleasant. Movement to shaded areas occurs and sitting or lying down replaces the standing and bending postures of active field work. Waiting for cooler temperatures requires no activity beyond remaining in place and allowing time to pass. Afternoon work resumes when the sun has moved far enough to reduce the direct heat intensity in working areas. The same tasks that were paused earlier are continued from the point where they were interrupted without need for reorientation. Hands return to pulling weeds or adjusting irrigation flow or whatever other activity was underway before the rest period. The work continues until light begins to fade or until the planned amount has been completed for that day. Evening preparations begin with building up cooking fires that have been allowed to decrease during the afternoon hours. Wood is added in the same quantities and arrangements used during morning cooking to achieve similar heat distribution. Food items are prepared using the same cutting and mixing techniques applied during breakfast preparation with different ingredients but identical methods. Pots are positioned over fires in the same relationships to heat sources that have proven effective through long use. The evening meal is consumed in the same manner as the morning meal, with sitting and eating and drinking following familiar patterns. Darkness increases as the meal progresses and fires provide the primary light source for the remaining evening period. Conversations happen or do not happen depending on whether anyone has something to communicate that seems worth the effort of speaking. Silence is equally acceptable and occurs more frequently than extended exchanges of words and observations. Sleep preparation involves unrolling mats that were rolled that same morning and placing them in the positions they occupy every night. Bodies lie down on these mats in customary positions and arrangements determined by household composition and personal preference. The sounds of the village gradually decrease as people settle into sleep at times that vary slightly but fall within a narrow range. Darkness and quiet become the predominant conditions as the day ends in the same manner that every day ends. Water continues to be carried from the river each day in the same containers along the same path. The routine of filling and carrying and pouring repeats without requiring any modification to the established method. Arms and shoulders bear the weight in positions that have become completely natural through extended repetition over time. The river provides water as it has always provided water and will continue to provide water indefinitely into the future. Grain continues to be ground each morning using the same stones that have ground grain for many seasons already. The circular motion of the upper stone across the lower stone produces flour at a rate that matches the household's daily consumption. The resulting flour has the same texture and color it has always had when ground from the same type of grain. This flour is mixed with water to form dough in proportions that have been used countless times before. Bread continues to be baked on the same hot surfaces with the same fuel, creating the same level of heat. Each piece of dough transforms into bread through exposure to this heat for the duration that experience has shown to be sufficient. The bread that results serves the same purpose of providing food that bread has always served in this place. Eating this bread sustains bodies in the way that eating bread sustains bodies everywhere it is consumed regularly. Fields continue to require attention in the form of watering and weeding and monitoring for various problems that might arise. The same sections of land are worked in the same sequence, moving from one area to the next in an established pattern. Plants grow or fail to grow based on conditions of soil and water and sunlight that are present during their development. The outcomes are generally similar to previous outcomes when conditions are generally similar to previous conditions. Animals continue to need feeding and watering and containment within their designated pens and grazing areas throughout each day. The same amounts of food and water are provided at the same times to maintain the animals in healthy functional condition. Their behavior follows patterns that have been observed so many times that any deviation from these patterns becomes immediately noticeable. Deviations are addressed if they indicate a problem requiring intervention or are simply noted if they seem insignificant. Cooking fires continue to be built and maintained using wood gathered from the same types of sources that have supplied fuel previously. The fires burn with the same appearance and produce the same amount of heat when constructed with the same materials. Smoke rises from these fires and disperses into the air above the village as it does every morning and evening. The smell of smoke and cooking food marks these times of day just as it has always marked these times. Tools continue to be used for the same purposes they have always served and are maintained to preserve their functionality over time. Sharpening is done when edges become dull from repeated contact with soil or plant material or other work substances. Handles are checked for cracks or looseness and are repaired or replaced when problems are found during these inspections. The same tools are used year after year until they wear out completely and must be replaced with newly made equivalents. Storage containers continue to hold grain and water and other materials that need to be kept in specific locations for easy access. The containers sit in the same positions they have occupied since they were first placed in those locations. Items are removed from these containers as needed and the containers are refilled when their contents run low or are exhausted. This cycle of emptying and refilling continues as long as the containers remain intact and functional for their intended purpose. Mats continue to be rolled each morning and unrolled each evening in the same locations within each sleeping structure. The rolling and unrolling require the same physical motions that have been performed daily for as long as the mats have existed. The mats show increasing signs of wear over time but continue to provide adequate cushioning and insulation from the ground surface. They will eventually need replacement when the wear makes them too thin or too damaged to serve their function adequately. Paths through the village continue to be walked by the same people moving between the same locations for the same purposes. The ground becomes harder along these paths from the compacting effect of repeated foot traffic over extended periods. Dust on these paths is disturbed by passing feet and settles again after the person has moved beyond that particular spot. The paths require no maintenance beyond this natural process of compaction through use and settling after disturbance. Irrigation channels continue to carry water from the river to the fields when they are open to allow flow. The water moves through these channels at a rate determined by the slope and the width and the volume entering from the river. Debris continues to accumulate in the channels and continues to be removed during regular inspection and maintenance activities. The channels function adequately as long as this maintenance prevents blockages from forming and restricting the necessary water flow. Washing continues to be done in the river or with water carried to the village for that specific purpose when needed. Clothes are soaked and rubbed and wrung out using the same techniques that have always been used for this task. Bodies are rinsed with water poured from containers or by wading into the river during appropriate seasons and conditions. Cleanliness is maintained at a level that prevents obvious dirt accumulation while accepting that some amount of dust and soil contact is inevitable. Sleeping continues to occur during the hours of darkness when visibility is too limited for most productive work activities. Bodies lie on mats in positions that have become habitual for each individual person over time through nightly repetition. Sleep comes at varying speeds depending on tiredness and comfort and other factors that affect the ease of transition from wakefulness. The duration of sleep varies somewhat but generally fills most of the hours between sunset and sunrise each night. Waking continues to happen when light increases to levels that penetrate into sleeping areas and stimulate awareness of the new day. The transition from sleep to full wakefulness takes a few moments during which orientation to surroundings is re-established. Morning routines begin as soon as full awareness returns and the body is ready to move and engage in physical activity. These routines proceed in their accustomed order without requiring conscious planning or decision-making about sequence or priority. Seasonal changes continue to bring variations in temperature and rainfall and river levels according to patterns that repeat annually. The same crops are planted during the same seasons when conditions favor their growth and development toward harvestable maturity. Harvesting occurs when the crops reach the appropriate stage of ripeness indicated by observable characteristics that have been learned through experience. The harvested material is processed and stored using methods that have proven effective in previous cycles of the same seasonal pattern. Maintenance of structures continues as cracks develop in walls and roofs deteriorate from exposure to weather conditions over time. Repairs are made using the same materials and techniques that were used to construct the original structures initially. The repaired sections blend with the surrounding original material and become indistinguishable after a short period of weathering and use. Additional repairs will be needed in the future as continued exposure and use create new problems requiring attention and correction. Social interactions continue to occur between people who live in proximity and share work activities and meal times regularly. Conversations address immediate practical matters or proceed in silence when no information needs to be exchanged between the parties. Relationships between people remain relatively stable over time, with changes occurring slowly as children grow and older people decline. The composition of households shifts gradually through births and deaths that occur at intervals throughout the ongoing flow of years. Knowledge continues to be passed from older individuals to younger ones through demonstration and supervised practice of essential skills. The younger people learn by watching and attempting and receiving correction when their efforts do not match the expected standard. Over time, their performance improves until it matches the level of those who taught them the same skills. They will in turn teach the next generation using the same methods they experienced during their own period of learning and skill development. Days continue to pass one after another in sequence without interruption or deviation from the forward progression of time. Each day resembles the previous day in most essential aspects while containing minor variations in specific details and circumstances. These variations are accommodated within the framework of established routines that provide structure and predictability to daily existence. The routines continue because they serve necessary functions and because they have become the accepted way of organizing time and activity. Containers are filled with water and emptied and filled again in a cycle that has no clear beginning or ending point. The same hands grip the same handles and lift the same weight day after day without remarkable variation. Water moves from the river to the village and is consumed or used, and then more water is carried to replace what was used. The process maintains itself through simple repetition according to the ongoing need for water in the village. Bread is made from flour that comes from grain that was harvested from fields that were planted and tended over preceding months. The grain becomes flour and the flour becomes dough and the dough becomes bread through steps that follow one another in fixed order. The bread is eaten and provides sustenance, and then more grain is ground to begin the sequence again. This cycle operates continuously, with each day's bread coming from grain processed that same morning in most cases. Fires are started from embers saved from previous fires or are generated through friction when no embers remain viable. Wood burns and becomes ash, and the ash is cleared away to make room for new wood that will also burn. Heat from the burning wood cooks food and provides warmth and light according to what is needed at that time. The fire diminishes when fuel is not added and must be rebuilt when heat or light is required again. Sweeping removes dust from floors, and the dust settles again after the sweeping is completed and time passes. The same floor is swept each morning and becomes dusty again by the following morning, requiring the same sweeping action. The broom moves through the same motions and achieves the same temporary result of a cleaner surface that will not remain clean. This temporary cleanliness is sufficient because permanent cleanliness is not achievable in these conditions with available methods. Animals eat the food that is provided and then require more food when sufficient time has passed since the previous feeding. Water is consumed and containers are emptied and must be refilled to ensure continuous availability for the animals. Waste is produced and accumulates and is removed and then accumulates again, requiring another removal at a later time. The animals continue these basic functions of eating and drinking and producing waste as long as they remain alive. Plants in the fields grow larger and develop and eventually produce seeds or are harvested for other edible parts they contain. The harvested plants are replaced by new plants grown from seeds saved from previous harvests or obtained through other means. Growth and harvest and replanting follow one another in sequence determined by the growing season and the maturation time of each plant type. The fields are never completely empty but contain plants at various stages of development throughout most of the year. Clothing is worn and becomes soiled and is washed and dried and worn again in continuous rotation. The same garments move through this cycle repeatedly until they become too worn to serve their function adequately. They are then replaced with new garments or are cut down into smaller pieces for other uses before being discarded. New garments are made using the same techniques that produced the garments they are replacing in the rotation of available clothing. Mats are unrolled for sleeping and rolled for storage and unrolled again when sleeping time returns each evening. The fibers in the mats gradually break down from this repeated rolling and unrolling and from the pressure of bodies lying on them. Small repairs are made when individual fibers break or when small holes develop in the woven structure. Eventually the mats deteriorate beyond practical repair and must be replaced with newly woven ones made from fresh materials. Paths are walked and the walking compacts the soil and makes the paths more defined over time as regular routes of movement. The edges of paths remain less compacted and plants may grow there until foot traffic extends into those areas and prevents growth. Wide paths become narrower or narrow paths become wider depending on how many people use them and where they choose to place their feet. The paths exist because people walk and people walk where paths exist in a relationship that reinforces itself continuously. Storage areas contain materials until those materials are removed for use and then contain different materials or the same type of materials replenished. The containers and spaces remain relatively constant while their contents change according to what is stored and what is removed. Empty storage capacity is filled when materials need storing and becomes empty again when the materials are used for their intended purposes. This alternation between full and empty states continues as long as the storage system remains in use. Light increases each morning and decreases each evening following the sun's movement across the sky in its daily arc. The same progression of changing light levels occurs every day with only gradual seasonal variation in timing and duration. Activities are aligned with these light levels because visibility determines what tasks can be performed effectively at different times. Darkness brings most activity to a halt and light allows activity to resume when morning returns once more. Sounds of daily life create a pattern that becomes familiar through constant repetition across days and weeks and months. Grinding stones produce their characteristic noise during morning hours when grain is being processed into flour for bread. Animals make sounds associated with feeding times and other regular activities that occur within their pens or grazing areas. Human voices are heard occasionally, but silence is more common than extended conversation in most daily situations and contexts. Temperatures rise during the day and fall during the night in a cycle that repeats regardless of season, though the range varies. Bodies adjust to these temperature changes through moving to shade or sun and through minor modifications to clothing as needed. The warmest part of the day is avoided for strenuous work when possible by pausing activity during those hours. Cooler morning and late afternoon periods are used for tasks that generate body heat through physical exertion and movement. Rainfall occurs with frequency that varies by season but follows general patterns observed over many years of living in this location. Rain fills the river and saturates the soil and provides water for plants without requiring human effort to distribute it. The absence of rain creates conditions that require irrigation to maintain crops and more frequent trips to carry water from the river. Both conditions are accommodated through adjustments to daily routines that remain otherwise similar in their basic structure and sequence. Wind moves air and carries dust and disperses smoke and affects the comfort level of outdoor activities when it blows strongly. Strong wind requires securing loose materials and checking structures for damage from the force applied to roofs and walls. Calm conditions allow dust to settle and smoke to hang in the air without being dispersed away from its source. The presence or absence of wind is noted and activities are adjusted slightly if the wind affects the feasibility of specific tasks. Clouds form and move across the sky and sometimes produce rain and sometimes dissipate without releasing any water to the ground. Their presence affects the intensity of sunlight reaching the ground and creates variations in temperature through shading effects. Cloud patterns are observed as potential indicators of coming rain, though this prediction is unreliable and often inaccurate. The sky contains clouds or does not contain clouds, and this condition changes throughout each day according to atmospheric processes not directly controlled by human action. Stars become visible when darkness is complete and the sky is clear of clouds that would block the view. The same stars appear in the same patterns they have always shown when observed from this location on the Earth. Their positions shift gradually through the night as the Earth rotates, but the overall pattern remains constant across nights and seasons. No particular attention is paid to stars beyond noting their presence as part of the night sky and using their visibility as an indication of clear weather conditions. The moon goes through its cycle of phases from new to full and back to new again over the course of approximately 1 month. Its presence provides some light during night hours when it is visible and in phases bright enough to illuminate the ground. Tasks are not typically performed by moonlight, but its presence is noted when moving around the village during evening hours. The cycle continues independently of human activity and provides a longer time marker than the daily cycle of the sun. Seasons progress from one to the next through gradual transitions rather than abrupt changes in conditions and requirements. Each season has characteristic weather patterns and associated tasks that are performed during those months when conditions are appropriate. The sequence of seasons is known from repeated experience, and upcoming changes can be anticipated based on current observations. Preparation for the next season begins while the current season is still dominant and the transition has not yet fully occurred. Water is carried because it is needed, and it will be needed again after it has been used for the current day's purposes. The path to the river exists because people walk it to reach the water that flows there continuously. Containers hold the water during transport from the river to places where the water will be poured out and consumed. This sequence happens each day and will happen the following day in the same manner with the same essential components. Grain sits in storage until it is removed for grinding into flour that will be mixed with water to form dough. The dough is shaped and placed on heat until it becomes bread that can be eaten to provide nourishment. The bread is consumed and more grain is removed from storage to repeat the process when bread is needed again. Storage containers hold grain and then hold less grain and are eventually refilled with grain from the next harvest. Animals remain in pens or graze in fields under supervision to prevent them from wandering away from the designated areas. They consume food and water that is provided and produce waste that must be removed to maintain sanitary conditions in the spaces they occupy. The animals continue to exist and require these same inputs each day for as long as they are kept. Their presence requires ongoing attention, but this attention follows established patterns that do not change significantly over time. Fields contain soil that receives seeds and water and produces plants when conditions allow growth to occur as expected. The plants develop through stages from germination to maturity following their natural progression when not interrupted by problems. Harvesting removes the mature plants and the fields are prepared again for the next planting when the season is appropriate. The same fields are used repeatedly because they are located near the village and have soil suitable for growing crops. Fires burn when fuel is present and air can reach the burning material to support continued combustion of the wood or other substances. Heat rises from the fire and can be used for cooking or for warmth depending on what is needed at that time. The fire continues until fuel is exhausted or until it is deliberately extinguished by removing fuel or cutting off air supply. New fires are built when heat is required and previous fires have gone out completely or have diminished below useful levels. Clothing covers bodies and protects skin from sun and from minor scrapes during work and other activities performed throughout each day. The same pieces of clothing are worn repeatedly until they are washed and then they are worn again after drying. Worn areas develop in places where friction is greatest during typical movements, and these areas eventually fail and require repair. The clothing serves its function until damage becomes too extensive and replacement becomes necessary to maintain adequate coverage and protection. Structures provide shelter from sun and rain and define spaces where specific activities occur with some degree of separation from outdoor conditions. Walls and roofs remain in position once constructed unless damage occurs that requires repair to restore their function. The interior spaces are used for sleeping and for storing items that need protection from weather or from animals. These structures continue to serve their purposes as long as they remain standing and intact enough to provide the intended separation. Tools perform their designated functions when held and moved in the appropriate manner by someone who has learned the proper technique. The same tools are used each time the same task needs to be performed because they have been shaped specifically for that purpose. They wear down gradually from repeated use and contact with materials being worked and must eventually be replaced or repaired. The replacement tools are made to the same specifications as the ones they replace because those specifications have proven effective. Mats provide cushioning between bodies and the hard ground surface during sleeping hours when people lie down for extended periods. They are positioned on the floor in the same locations each evening because those locations have been designated for sleeping by the people who use them. The mats remain functional until the woven material breaks down from age and use to the point where comfort and insulation are no longer adequate. New mats are woven to replace worn ones using techniques identical to those used for making the original mats. Containers hold substances that need to be kept in specific locations or transported from one place to another for various purposes. The containers are made to appropriate sizes and shapes for their intended contents and uses based on requirements that have been established through practice. They develop cracks or chips from handling and thermal stress over time and are replaced when damage prevents them from functioning reliably. The making of containers continues as needed to maintain an adequate supply for all the storage and transport requirements of daily life. Paths direct foot traffic along routes that connect locations between which people need to move during their daily activities and tasks. The paths become more defined through continued use as traffic compacts the soil and removes vegetation that might otherwise grow in those areas. No deliberate maintenance is required because the walking itself maintains the paths in usable condition through the physical effects of repeated passage. The paths persist as long as people continue to walk them regularly for accessing the locations they connect. Irrigation channels direct water from the river to fields where crops are growing and need moisture to support their continued development. The channels are opened when water is needed and closed when sufficient water has been delivered to the designated areas. Debris that accumulates in the channels is removed during periodic inspections to ensure water can flow without obstruction when the channels are opened. The channels function adequately as long as their walls remain intact and their interiors remain clear of blocking materials. Light from the sun allows visibility for performing tasks that require seeing details or moving safely through the environment without stumbling. The amount of light changes gradually through the day as the sun moves across the sky from east to west. Activities are scheduled according to when light will be available for tasks that cannot be performed effectively in darkness or dim conditions. Darkness brings most activity to a stop until light returns with the next sunrise and makes activity practical again. Sounds occur as a result of various activities being performed or as natural phenomena in the environment surrounding the village. Grinding produces one type of sound and animals produce other sounds, and wind moving through structures produces yet another type. The sounds become familiar through constant exposure and are noticed mainly when they are absent or when an unexpected sound occurs. Most sounds are simply part of the background of daily existence and do not require attention or response from those who hear them. Temperatures affect comfort levels and determine which activities are feasible during different parts of the day or different seasons of the year. Bodies adjust to temperature through seeking shade or sun and through minor changes in physical activity levels and clothing. The hottest parts of the day are avoided for strenuous work when possible by resting during those hours instead. Temperature variations are accommodated within the daily routine rather than being controlled or modified through any technological means currently available. Weather conditions influence what work can be done effectively on any particular day depending on whether rain is falling or wind is blowing strongly. Most outdoor activities can continue in all but the most severe weather, though comfort and efficiency may be reduced during difficult conditions. Extended periods of unusual weather may disrupt normal routines, but typical weather variations are absorbed into the flexible structure of daily work patterns. The weather does what it does and people adjust their activities in response to the conditions that exist at any given time. Seasons bring changes in weather patterns and in which crops can be planted and what maintenance tasks are needed for structures and tools. The same seasonal patterns repeat each year with minor variations in timing and intensity, but with overall consistency in the general progression. Preparation for upcoming seasonal requirements begins before the current season has fully ended based on observation of typical transition timing. The agricultural calendar follows the seasons because plant growth depends on temperature and moisture conditions that vary seasonally in predictable ways. Time passes through days and nights and seasons in continuous forward movement that cannot be stopped or reversed by any action. Each day is similar to the previous day and will be similar to the following day in most respects that matter for daily functioning. The passage of time is marked by the sun and the moon and the seasons rather than by any constructed calendar or measurement system. Events occur in sequence and the sequence continues as long as conditions permit life to continue in this location. Containers are filled and carried and emptied in the same manner they have been filled and carried and emptied previously without alteration. The handles are gripped in the same way and the weight is distributed across the same parts of the body during transport. Water moves from the river into the containers and then from the containers into storage vessels or directly into use for cooking or washing. The containers are then empty until they are filled again when more water is needed for the household's ongoing requirements. Grinding happens in the morning when flour is needed for making bread to be eaten during the day's meals and activities. The stones move against each other with grain between them and the grain becomes progressively finer as the grinding continues. Flour collects around the edges of the lower stone and is gathered and placed into a bowl or basket for use. The grinding stops when enough flour has been produced for the current need and will resume the next morning when flour is needed again. Dough is formed by combining flour and water in proportions that create the proper consistency for shaping and baking into bread. Hands work the mixture until it holds together and can be divided into portions suitable for individual loaves or flatbreads. The portions are shaped and placed on heated surfaces where they cook until the transformation from dough to bread is complete. The bread is removed from the heat and allowed to cool slightly before being consumed as part of a meal. Eating provides the body with energy and nutrients needed to continue performing the physical tasks required by daily life in this environment. The same types of food are eaten repeatedly because they are what grows in the local fields or can be obtained through available means. Bread and vegetables and occasionally fish or eggs comprise the majority of meals consumed throughout the year with minor seasonal variations. The act of eating happens when food is available and hunger is present and ends when sufficient food has been consumed. Fires continue to be built when heat is needed for cooking or warmth during cooler periods of the day or night. Wood is placed and arranged and ignited and the fire burns as long as fuel remains available to support combustion. The heat produced rises upward and spreads outward, affecting the temperature in the immediate area around the fire. When the fire is no longer needed, it is allowed to die down as fuel is consumed and not replaced with additional material. Sweeping removes accumulated dust and debris from floor surfaces to maintain them in a condition suitable for walking and sitting and sleeping. The broom is moved in strokes that push the unwanted material toward the doorway or another exit point from the interior space. The swept material is pushed outside where it falls to the ground and mixes with soil and other materials in the outdoor environment. The floor remains clean for a period of time before dust settles again and the next sweeping becomes necessary. Animals continue their existence in pens or grazing areas where they consume food and water provided by the people who maintain them. The animals move within the available space and interact with each other according to their nature and social patterns. Waste accumulates beneath them and must be removed at intervals to prevent buildup that would create unsanitary conditions or attract pests. The animals serve purposes related to food production or work assistance depending on their type and the needs of the household that keeps them. Fields remain in their locations and contain soil that has been worked many times for growing crops that provide food for consumption. Seeds are placed in this soil when conditions are appropriate, and the seeds germinate and grow into plants if moisture and temperature allow. The plants develop through their natural life cycle and are harvested when they reach the stage where their edible portions are ready. The fields are then prepared again for the next planting cycle, which will follow the same basic pattern as all previous cycles. Irrigation channels exist to carry water from the river to fields during periods when rainfall is insufficient to support crop growth adequately. The channels are opened by removing barriers that block water flow and closed by replacing those barriers when enough water has been delivered. Water moves through the channels following the slope of the land and gravity that pulls it downward toward lower elevations. The channels require periodic clearing to remove debris that accumulates and would eventually obstruct the flow if left in place. Tools are stored in designated locations when not actively being used for their intended purposes during work activities. The storage locations are the same places used previously because they are convenient to access and provide some protection from weather exposure. The tools are retrieved when needed and returned when the task requiring them has been completed for the day or work session. This pattern of storage and retrieval continues as long as the tools remain functional and the tasks they serve continue to be performed. Clothing is worn during waking hours and removed before sleeping in most cases to prevent unnecessary wear during periods of inactivity. The same garments are put on repeatedly until they become soiled enough to require washing or until they are rotated with other available pieces. Washing removes accumulated dirt and sweat and restores the clothing to a condition suitable for continued wearing until the next washing becomes necessary. The cycle of wearing and washing continues until the fabric deteriorates beyond practical use and must be replaced with newly made clothing. Structures stand in their positions and provide the shelter and defined space they were built to provide for the people who use them. The walls and roofs remain in place unless damaged by weather or deterioration of materials over extended time periods. Maintenance activities address problems as they develop to keep the structures functional for their intended purposes of protecting occupants and stored items. The structures continue to serve as long as repairs can keep ahead of ongoing deterioration from exposure to environmental conditions. Mats are unrolled each evening for sleeping and rolled each morning for storage in a cycle that repeats every day without exception. The material gradually weakens from this repeated handling and from the pressure of bodies lying on the mats during sleeping hours. Small damage is repaired when noticed and when repair seems likely to extend the useful life of the mat significantly. Eventually, the accumulated damage makes repair impractical and the mat is replaced with a new one woven from fresh plant materials. Paths continue to be walked by people moving between locations within the village or between the village and the river or fields beyond. The walking maintains the paths in usable condition by preventing vegetation from growing in the trafficked area and by compacting the soil surface. The paths follow routes determined by the locations they connect and by the easiest terrain for walking between those points. No formal planning created these paths, but rather they emerged from repeated passage along routes that proved practical for the movements people needed to make. Storage areas hold materials and tools and food items that are not currently in active use but will be needed at some future time. The items remain in storage until they are retrieved for use, and then they may be returned to storage afterward or may be consumed if they are food items. The storage areas stay relatively constant in their locations and purposes while their contents change according to what needs storing and what is being actively used. This system of storage and retrieval supports the functioning of daily life by keeping necessary items accessible but not cluttering the spaces used for other activities. Light enters through doorways and gaps in walls when the sun is above the horizon and illuminates interior spaces to varying degrees depending on the angle of sunlight. The amount of interior light changes throughout the day as the sun moves and shadows shift across openings in the structure. Most activities requiring good visibility are performed outdoors or during times when natural light is strongest inside the dwelling spaces. Darkness inside structures during night hours means that sleeping becomes the primary activity until dawn brings enough light to support resumed activity. Sounds of daily life create an auditory environment that includes grinding stones and animal noises and occasional human voices raised for communication purposes. Most of the time the sounds are familiar enough to be barely noticed by those who hear them constantly throughout their days. Unusual sounds attract attention briefly until their source is identified and determined to be harmless or requiring no particular response. The soundscape remains relatively constant with minor variations depending on which activities are being performed at any given moment during the day. Wind affects how comfortable it is to be outdoors and how much dust is stirred up from the ground into the air around the village. Strong wind requires adjusting how fires are managed and checking that loose materials are secured against being blown away from their proper locations. Calm air allows smoke to hang without dispersing and allows dust to settle onto surfaces where it accumulates until the next sweeping. Wind conditions change from day to day but fall within a range that has been experienced many times before in this location. Rain falls when atmospheric conditions produce it and provides water that soaks into the soil and fills the river and eliminates the need for irrigation temporarily. The rain creates muddy conditions that make some work more difficult and make walking paths slippery until the excess moisture drains or evaporates. After rain stops, the ground gradually dries and conditions return to the state that existed before the rainfall occurred. The cycle of wet and dry periods follows seasonal patterns that repeat annually with some variation in specific timing and amounts. Water is carried from the river in containers that have been used for this purpose many times before this day. The path between the river and the village is walked in the same manner it has been walked on previous occasions. Containers are filled at the river's edge where water flows past the same rocks and banks that have always been there. The water is carried back to the village and poured into storage vessels that hold it until it is used. Grain is removed from storage containers and placed on grinding stones that reduce it to flour through repeated motions. The flour is mixed with water to form dough that is shaped by hands into portions suitable for baking. These portions are placed on heated surfaces where they transform into bread through exposure to heat from the fire below. The bread is eaten when it has cooled enough to handle and provide sustenance for continuing the activities of the day. Animals are fed at times when feeding typically occurs based on patterns established through long practice in this place. Food is distributed in the pens where the animals are kept or in areas where they graze under supervision during daylight hours. The animals consume what is provided and continue their existence until the next feeding time arrives and the process repeats. Water is also provided in containers positioned where the animals can access it throughout the day as needed. Fields contain plants at various stages of growth depending on when they were planted and what type of plant they are. The plants are checked periodically to assess their condition and to perform any maintenance tasks that appear necessary at that time. Weeds are removed when they are noticed growing among the desired plants in locations where they compete for resources. Water is provided through irrigation channels when rainfall has been insufficient to maintain adequate soil moisture for supporting continued plant growth. Fires are built using wood that has been gathered and stored near the areas where fires are typically maintained for cooking purposes. The wood is arranged and ignited and burns until it is consumed or until the fire is allowed to die down. Heat from the fire is used for cooking food or for providing warmth depending on what is needed at that particular time. Ash accumulates in the fire pit and is cleared away periodically to make room for new fuel and to prevent excessive buildup. Sweeping moves dust and small debris from interior floor surfaces toward doorways where it is pushed outside into the open air. The same floor areas are swept regularly because dust settles continuously and accumulates on surfaces throughout each day and night. The broom moves in familiar patterns across the floor, removing what has accumulated since the previous sweeping session. The floor remains clean for a period before dust begins settling again and the next sweeping becomes necessary. Mats are unrolled for sleeping when evening arrives and darkness makes other activities difficult to perform without adequate light. The mats are positioned in the same locations they occupied the previous night and will occupy again the following night. Bodies lie down on these mats and sleep occurs during the hours when darkness prevents visibility for work or movement. The mats are rolled again in the morning when light returns and activities resume that require the floor space where the mats were spread. Clothing is worn during the day and removed for sleeping or washing when those activities occur according to need and preference. The same garments are used repeatedly in rotation with other available pieces until washing becomes necessary to remove accumulated soil. Washing is done with water in the river or with water carried to the village specifically for that purpose when river washing is not practical. The washed clothing dries in sun and air and is worn again, continuing the cycle of use and washing. Tools are picked up when tasks requiring them need to be performed and are set down when those tasks are completed. The tools are stored in locations where they can be found easily when needed again for similar tasks in the future. Sharpening and other maintenance happens when the tools show reduced effectiveness from where that occurs through normal use over time. The maintained tools continue to function in their designated roles until they wear out completely and must be replaced with new ones. Containers hold water or grain or other materials that need to be kept in specific places for access when those materials are required. The containers sit in their usual positions until they are moved for filling or emptying or cleaning as the situation requires. Empty containers are refilled when new supplies of the material they hold become available from harvesting or gathering or other obtaining methods. Full containers are emptied gradually as their contents are used, and then the cycle of filling and emptying continues. Paths are walked by people moving between locations for purposes related to water carrying or field work or tending animals in their designated areas. The paths follow the routes that connect these locations and that provide the most practical passage across the terrain between them. Walking maintains the paths in usable condition through the physical effects of repeated foot traffic compacting the soil and preventing plant growth. The paths continue to serve their function as long as people continue moving along them regularly. Irrigation channels carry water from the river to fields when they are open to allow flow to occur through the prepared routes. The water moves along these channels following gravity and the slope that was created when the channels were originally formed. Debris is removed from the channels when it accumulates enough to restrict flow or to threaten blockage of the water passage. The channels function adequately when they are kept clear and when their walls remain intact and properly positioned. Light increases each morning as the sun rises above the horizon and begins its daily movement across the sky overhead. The increasing light allows activities to resume that require visibility for safe and effective performance of necessary tasks. Light decreases each evening as the sun approaches the opposite horizon and eventually drops below it, leaving darkness. The darkness brings most activity to a halt until light returns with the next sunrise and the daily cycle begins again. Sounds occur as results of various activities and natural processes happening in and around the village throughout each day. Grinding produces sound when stones move against grain and crush it into progressively finer particles of flour. Animals make sounds associated with their feeding and movement and interactions with each other in the spaces where they are kept. These sounds form a familiar background that changes only slightly from one day to the next in its overall character and composition. Temperature rises during the morning hours as the sun climbs higher and heat accumulates in the air and on surfaces exposed to sunlight. The temperature reaches its peak during the middle part of the day when the sun is at its highest point above the horizon. Cooling begins in the afternoon and continues through evening and night as heat dissipates into the atmosphere and away from the ground. The daily temperature cycle repeats with minor variations depending on cloud cover and wind and other weather factors affecting heat retention. Seasons progress through their established pattern of wet and dry periods that bring different conditions for working and growing crops in the fields. The wet season provides rain that fills the river and saturates the soil, reducing the need for irrigation during that time. The dry season follows with reduced rainfall and lower river levels requiring more active water management through the irrigation system. The seasonal pattern repeats annually and the activities of the village adjust to accommodate the changing conditions each season brings. Days continue to follow one another in unbroken sequence, moving forward through time without pause or interruption in the progression. Each day contains the same basic elements of waking and working and eating and sleeping arranged in familiar order throughout the daylight and darkness hours. The activities performed vary slightly in their specific details but remain similar in their general nature and purpose from day to day. The pattern continues as it has continued and as it will continue for as long as conditions allow this way of life to persist. Water is carried and grain is ground and bread is baked and eaten in the same manner these things have been done before. Animals are fed and fields are tended and tools are used and maintained according to established methods that serve their purposes adequately. The river flows and the sun moves and the seasons change following patterns that existed before and will continue after. Life proceeds through its routines in this place along the river where these activities occur and repeat themselves without end.